This is the brand new MJX H8H crawler, and this 1/8 scale beast has some features in it that I don't think you've ever seen before. We're gonna do a deep dive into this thing, then see just how much performance we can squeeze out of its brushless drivetrain, and see if this thing's worth the money. MJX Hyper Go calls this thing 1/8 scale, but that's a little bit confusing because 1/10 scale crawlers can sometimes be called 1/10 scale, and sometimes they're called 1/8 scale. MJX calls this 1/8 scale, but as you can see, this thing is way bigger than a standard 1/10 scale. This big 1/8 scale crawler looks really nice too. As you can see, this is a classic Land Rover body. It's got a ton of hard plastic details, including an exoskeleton cage, fender flares, the bumpers, rock sliders, a bunch of lights all over it that we'll definitely be checking out in a little bit, and some other cool scale detail on the back with these gas cans and jack. But like so many things, it's what's underneath this body that's really awesome. So let's take a closer look at that. This body has a system for opening that I've never seen before. First, you take this easy to remove thumb screw out. Once you've done that, the front's still held on with 2 magnets. Those get released, and then you can lift the body up. To get that body all the way off, we just need to remove 2 hinge screws in the back. Remove the conveniently placed single wire going into the light controller, and then the body just lifts right off. Underneath the body, we've got the hinge mounts. Those look pretty beefy, and we've got a light controller here in the back. We've got a half interior, some pretty nice looking wiring and cable organization for the lights, and those go to the lights in the front where we can see the magnetic mounts as well as the nut for the thumb screw. Lexan body does have a lot of really nice hard plastic details, and it even has some steel posts in the back to support the top. But the really cool stuff's under the body. This thing's got a brushless FOC power system. We'll talk more about FOC in a little bit. It's got 2 different places you can put your battery locking differentials, a 2-speed transmission, a really nice looking chassis, and overall looks like it's gonna be a lot of fun. This thing's rolling on some pretty soft feeling tires. Let's take a closer look. These tires do appear to be a unique tread pattern that I've not seen before. They are not on bead locks, though. These are glued to the rim. And these are some of the softest tires I've ever felt on an RTR truck. This should be great for rock crawling, but might not be good for speed running on 4S, which we're probably gonna be getting into later. So we might end up having to see what other tires will fit this truck. These tires have a 12mm hex. The wheel nut is serrated and nylock, which is great to see. Let's go ahead and get the rest of these wheels off so we can get a good look at this drivetrain. Those wheels are connected to the portal axles with 12mm aluminum hexes. Those portal axles look nice and beefy, and they are connected to the chassis with aluminum links, front and rear. There's something pretty interesting going on in the rear with those links, though. And that's this extra set of links here in the back. I was actually scratching my head about what these were for at first, but it appears as though this is a special off-road anti-sway system that helps prevent body roll, but still allows for full articulation off-road. That's a pretty interesting design, and I'm excited to see how that affects general bashing performance. Speaking of performance, let's take a closer look at one of these axles. Well, we've got these shocks off. Let's take a closer look at those. These are aluminum threaded body shocks with plastic caps. The shafts on them are pretty thick. They kind of remind me of Traxxas Max shocks, just a little bit smaller. And they've got a really interesting feature. This is the main spring on the outside, but then there's a secondary spring actually on the shaft itself. That's going to give it a progressive spring rate, which again should help with off-road performance. Though I do wonder if this inner spring might end up scratching the shaft eventually. Removing the cap on this shock, we can see it's a fairly standard bladder design. Looks to be pretty full of fluid, and the shock body is nice and thick. We'll have to see how they hold up long term, but so far none of the shocks are leaking out of the box, which is a great sign. The design of the center drive shaft uses a pin for retention and for transmitting power. That means we can't just pull the drive shaft apart, so that gives us an opportunity to see how good their thread locker is. Okay, not bad. There definitely is thread locker on there, and this grub pin looks nicely sized and of good quality. Last thing to remove is this locker cable. It looks like we need to take the differential apart in order to do that. That should let this cover come off with the locking mechanism. I definitely like how this locker mechanism is completely hidden inside the axle and doesn't have any exposed external components. Taking a quick look at this, we can see it's a fairly standard looking locker. We've got the locker fork here, and it actuates the locker here. I'll give you a closer look at that when we take it out. An interesting thing you can see here is that there's a spring pushing the locking mechanism into the locked position. They do this so that the servo doesn't have to be responsible for pushing the locker in. It just has to release pressure, and then the spring will hold it locked together. With how much of a beast this thing is, I'd love to see some machined gears under this cover. And no, unfortunately, we are going to get sintered steel gears. They do look pretty thick, though. Hopefully, they'll be able to hold up to some serious bashing. It looks like we're going to be getting shielded bearings throughout this truck. I would have loved to have seen sealed bearings, but they should be okay. We've also got a shim here, so make sure you don't lose that if you take yours apart. And we've got one more screw here. which releases the rest of the portal housing from the axle, and we get the drive shaft, and wow, that is a thick drive shaft, and interestingly, it has a universal joint on it. That makes me think these are probably the exact same drive shaft as in the front, which is great for parts compatibility, but these universals in the rear could be a weak point, especially when we go big power. The rest of it's held on with 4 screws buried deep inside here. No need to take those off as there's nothing else in there. And we can go ahead and just take this side off as one complete unit. This axle shaft is different from the other one, so they are going to be unique side to side. Removing that should let us take our differential out. This looks like a fairly standard locker style differential, and honestly, it's a little bit smaller than I was hoping to see. In case you haven't seen it before, these locker style differentials work in a very simple way. Basically, when this locking collar is pulled away, you can see the internal differential gear is able to spin. When the servo allows the spring to engage these dogs, it locks the side gear into the teeth, and then the axle is locked. It does look like all the parts on this are going to be sintered steel. Again, we'll just have to see how they hold up. Now stay tuned, because we've got some really exciting things to look at on this truck. And while I'm putting this back together, make sure you get subscribed. I've got a really cool build coming up, and we've got some new vehicles that you're not going to want to miss the teardowns on. Now before we flip this over to take a look at the really cool stuff, we can see we've got a fairly flat bottom here with just a little bit of a hump for the center. We've got a similar front axle to the rear axle with those same universals, kingpins with bushings, an aluminum servo horn with linear servo saver, and a nice high drag link that shouldn't get caught on rocks. And that's all going to be driven by this 2-speed transmission through this FOC motor that's 3970, which is almost 1/8 scale basher size and 1500 kV. So then what is FOC and why is it advantageous? A brushless system has to be able to sense where the magnets in the rotor are and then apply voltage and current to the windings inside the motor at the right time in order to spin the motor. Ideally, that timing would happen at the most efficient moment to be pulling the rotor toward the windings this way, but not out towards the windings this way, because that's just wasted energy and creates extra heat. However, because current lags behind voltage and that changes throughout time, the system can be very complicated. Field-oriented control uses a much more complex system for calculating when to actually fire those windings, which makes the brushless system more powerful, more controllable, and more efficient. Hopefully that's going to result in a really versatile truck. Now, speaking of the design of the truck, one thing I really like to see is how they have these servos set up. These shift servos are really easy to get to, and the one for the rear axle is even in the back. This means that taking this center transmission, which we're going to go ahead and do now to take a closer look inside, out of this truck should be pretty easy. And replacing these servos, if we ever have to, shouldn't be too difficult either. These shift servos do have really nice looking servo savers on them that seem to be pretty well thought out. However, these servos are not standard micro size. You can see that they're a little bit bigger than a standard micro servo. The FMS truck is the same way, which can make getting replacement servos a little bit more challenging. You can see the manufacturer actually raised the ESC mount up a little bit, and that's to give us access to this screw, which is a really nice touch. And now with just 6 screws, 3 wires, and 1 ball link removed, this should lift right out of here. And you can see this is quite the beefy power system. We do have a sliding motor mount here. Under this cover, we do have a steel pinion gear. Buried inside there, we do have a steel spur gear. And it kind of looks like this is set up for a slipper clutch, but this truck doesn't have one. If you haven't seen any of my previous videos on crawlers, I always recommend that you do not take these transmissions apart unless you absolutely have to, because they can be pretty difficult to get back together. Let's see how much we regret taking this one apart. So far it looks pretty good. We do definitely have all sintered gears here on the output. Some more shims in here, so make sure you keep track of those. We got a little bit of grease in here. This looks like a fairly standard transfer case area. All right, this is where things tend to get kind of iffy. Hopefully I don't get a bunch of springs to the face. So far so good, and we have a whole lot more sintered steel gears in here, along with some drive shafts, some pins, and the high-low shifting fork system. The fork itself does appear to be plastic, but everything else is steel. Let me get this back together, then we've got some really cool electronics to look at. Arguably the most exciting part of this truck is the electronics. Interestingly, I don't see anything in this manual that says whether or not these electronics are waterproof, so we're just gonna have to find out for ourselves. All right, taking the lid off this receiver box, we can see we do have a gasket here, as well as some grease around these connections, so there is some attempt at waterproofing going on here. Inside, we have an 8-channel receiver. To go along with that receiver, we have a new transmitter. It does feel pretty cheap, but it's got some features on it that I've never seen anybody else do, and that is custom labeling for these switches. You can see we have a front differential lock, high and low speed, and a rear differential lock, and they are perfectly labeled, so there's no confusion as to what they do. We've also got light control on here, and that light control control gives us a bunch of different options, including one where we don't have to have turn signals, which I think is great. We're gonna be checking out those lights in just a minute. Before we do that, we need to take a look at this FOC censored ESC. This thing's actually Bluetooth programmable, and as you can see, if we connect to it, we can see telemetry data from it, as well as change all the settings directly from the Bluetooth interface. I've had one other Snail ESC like this, and had no problems connecting to it through Bluetooth. That being said, I'm curious to see if they've waterproofed this, so let's take this cover off and see what's underneath. Okay, so it seems like this cover is actually glued on, which feels like kind of a misstep, because if this fan goes bad, you're kind of out of luck and can't replace it. That being said, I was able to sneak down in here and see just a little bit of shininess on the board, so I suspect this is waterproof, and combining that with the water-resistant sensor connection, I suspect this thing will at least be splash resistant. Along with everything else, we also got a sheet of stickers for the body. I'm not a really big fan of any of these stickers, and I recently got some laser cutter compatible vinyl, so let's go ahead and make our own. To do that, I'm gonna open up some drawing software. I'm just gonna use Lightburn here, but you could use any drawing software. I'm gonna create my design, and then I'm gonna bring it out to my brand new Algolaser Alpha MK2. This thing's really, really cool. Not only is it a 20-watt laser cutter, but unlike most laser cutters, this thing actually has a screen you can interact with, which means you can bring drawings out to it on a thumb drive, select your cutting preferences right here on the screen, and then go ahead and begin the cut without having to have a computer attached to it and using something like Lightburn to control the system. And there we go, easy as that. I love not having to use a computer at the laser cutter. Now, before we add this finishing touch, we need to put all of this back together. All right, she's all back together. I got that vinyl put on a little bit crooked, but not too bad. Let's get a 3S battery in this thing and see what it can do. All right, first things first, let's take a look at the light options. We've got running lights and parking lights, everything off, everything on with no turn signals, everything flashing faster, and then daytime running lights with turn signals. And of course, we got lights in the back too. All right, let's see how fast this thing is in high gear on 3S. That's pretty peppy for a crawler. That feels pretty good. This thing should be fun to bash. All right, let's see what we got. 15 miles an hour. That is the fastest crawler I've ever tested out of the box. Now, being a crawler, this needs to be able to go slow too. Let's see how slow it is in low gear. Wow, that's really slow. That's probably the slowest I've ever seen an RTR crawler go as well. This thing's gonna be pretty versatile. And the beauty of the FOC system is that it'll just keep adding power to get up and over obstacles without having to add more throttle. All right, guys, let's do some bashing. So far, this thing's a lot of fun, but you know we can't leave well enough alone on this channel, so let's make it faster. I definitely have to say that the FOC control with this ESC and motor feels kind of like a cheat code for crawling. It makes it a lot easier. And this setup means this is both the fastest and the slowest crawler I've ever had out of the box. Now, unfortunately, because these motor wires are a little bit short, I think we're gonna have to mount the ESC right here on the fender, which should be fine for testing purposes. For a more permanent install, you could use something like a 6S Spectrum ESC or just get motor wire extensions. And there we go, guys. It's a little janky, but it should work for now. The last thing I wanna do is change out these tires. These stock tires are great for crawling, but they're super squishy and not the best for general bashing. So let's go ahead and put these on. They're about the same size, a little bit wider, and should be quite a bit more stable. There we go, guys. To be honest with you, I think they look better than the stock tires. Let's see what this thing can do on 4S. Definitely got more spice. Full throttle. Yeah, she's faster. All right, let's give it one more pass. Full throttle. Let's see what that was. 23 miles an hour. That's 8 miles an hour more than it was before. Let's see how she bashes. Well, guys, she survived everything I threw at her, which included quite a few things that it was probably never meant to do. Everything's looking fine. This roof took a couple of pretty heavy hits, and the body still looks great. Got no issues under here whatsoever. The electronics are all still working just fine. In spite of being abused on 4S, the suspension and drivetrain are still looking fantastic. Overall, I'd have to say this is the most versatile out-of-the-box crawler I've ever had. That FOC-based brushless system makes this thing crawl really, really slowly and run 15 miles an hour in high gear, which is about 50% faster than most crawlers do out of the box, making this one of the best trail trucks you can buy. It handles pretty decently. The drivetrain's obviously fairly strong because I was abusing it on 4S and nothing broke. And right now it's selling for $600, which is only 50 bucks more than a TRX4. Of course, just like with any time you buy something that isn't coming from one of the major brands, parts availability and upgrades might be limited. I'm not gonna say they are gonna be limited, but they could be limited. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. But overall, if you're looking for a crawler that's bigger than a TRX4, has all kinds of features right out of the box, and is a pretty tough trail rig, I think you could do a lot worse than this H8H. And I think you could do a lot worse than checking out one of these guys.